What if I told you that beneath the calm, glittering surface of America's Great Lakes lies the largest freshwater graveyard on planet Earth? A watery tomb holding more than 6,000 shipwrecks, many of which have never been found, never been explained, and never given up their dead. What if I told you that some of those ships vanished on perfectly clear days, with no storms, no winds, no warnings, and that entire crews of dozens of men simply ceased to exist in a matter of minutes, leaving behind nothing but silence and questions that have haunted historians for over a century? This is not the Bermuda Triangle. This is not the open ocean. This is the American heartland. Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Minnesota, New York, your backyard. And the stories buried beneath these freshwater seas are more terrifying, more mysterious, and more heartbreaking than almost anything that has ever happened on the Atlantic or the Pacific. These are the ghost fleets of the Great Lakes, and America has almost completely forgotten them. The freshwater seas that swallowed empires. Most Americans, when they think of maritime disasters, think of the Titanic. They think of the Lusitania. They think of great ocean liners sinking in the vast black Atlantic, thousands of miles from shore. But the truth, the strange, almost unbelievable truth, is that the Great Lakes of North America have claimed more ships and more lives per square mile than any ocean on Earth. The numbers are staggering. Between the late 1600s and the mid-20th century, more than 6,000 vessels sank in the Great Lakes. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 30,000 people perished in those wrecks. Some historians believe the real number is far higher, perhaps 50,000 or more, because for centuries no one was keeping accurate records. Immigrant ships, fur-trading vessels, small schooners carrying families westward, they disappeared and no one ever wrote their names down. Lake Michigan alone holds an estimated 1,500 shipwrecks. Lake Huron has more than 1,000. Lake Superior, the largest, deepest, coldest, and most savage of the five, holds at least 550 known wrecks, but researchers believe hundreds more remain undiscovered in its abyssal depths, some lying in water nearly 1,400 feet deep, in temperatures just above freezing, in perpetual darkness. And here is the detail that chills historians and divers to this day. Because the Great Lakes are fresh water, and because their deep waters remain near freezing year-round, the bodies of the drowned do not decompose the way they do in salt water. There are no ocean scavengers, no crabs, no large bottom-feeding fish to consume human remains. The cold, fresh water preserves everything. Divers who have descended to deep wrecks in Lake Superior have reported finding human remains still wearing clothing, still positioned at their stations, still holding tools, looking almost exactly as they did on the day they died, decades or even a century ago. The Great Lakes do not give up their dead, they keep them. November, the month the lakes become killers. Sailors who worked the Great Lakes had a saying, "The lakes are sweetwater seas with saltwater tempers," and nowhere was this truer than in the month of November. The Great Lakes occupy a unique and terrifying meteorological position. They are large enough to generate their own weather systems. When Arctic air from Canada sweeps south in late autumn and collides with the relatively warm water of the lakes, the result is a phenomenon that meteorologists call a November witch, a cyclonic storm of almost hurricane force intensity that can appear with shocking speed and transform a calm lake into a seething cauldron of 30-foot waves, blinding snow, and winds exceeding 70 miles per hour. These storms have no equivalent anywhere else in fresh water. They are ocean storms trapped in an inland basin, and they are made more dangerous by the geography of the lakes themselves. Unlike the open ocean, where a ship can run before a storm for hundreds of miles, the Great Lakes are enclosed.
A ship caught in a November storm on Lake Superior has nowhere to go. The rocky coastlines offer no shelter. The harbors are few and far between. The shallowed areas near shore create standing waves that can snap a 500-foot steel freighter in half. And that is exactly what happened, again and again and again, throughout American history. The Great Storm of 1913, the White Hurricane. No single event in Great Lakes history is more catastrophic, more mysterious, or more forgotten than the Great Storm of November 1913, known to sailors as the White Hurricane. It began on November 7, 1913, when the U.S. Weather Bureau issued storm warnings across the Great Lakes. But the warnings were inadequate. The Bureau did not fully understand what was coming. Two massive storm systems, one sweeping east from the Rockies, the other driving south from the Arctic, were converging directly over the Great Lakes in a meteorological collision of almost unprecedented violence. By November 9th, the combined storm had become a monster. Winds exceeded 90 miles per hour. Waves on Lake Huron reached 35 feet, the height of a 3-story building. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to 0. The temperature plummeted, and on the lakes, more than 70 ships were fighting for their lives. Over the next 3 days, 19 ships were destroyed. 12 of them sank with all hands, every single crew member lost. More than 250 sailors died. Bodies washed ashore for weeks afterward, frozen solid, encased in ice, scattered along hundreds of miles of coastline from Michigan to Ontario. Many were never identified. They were buried in mass graves in small lakeside towns, their headstones marked only with the word unknown. But the most disturbing mystery of the White Hurricane involved a ship called the Charles S. Price. The Charles S. Price was a massive steel freighter, 524 feet long, one of the largest ships on the lakes. She was last seen on Lake Huron on November 9th, heading north into the teeth of the storm, and then she vanished. 2 days later, a ship was spotted floating upside down on Lake Huron, her hull protruding from the water like the back of an enormous whale. No one could identify her. She had completely capsized, something that engineers had believed was virtually impossible for a ship of her size and design. For days, she floated there, anonymous, inverted, while rescue teams circled her in smaller vessels, unable to determine which ship she was. It took nearly a week before a diver was finally sent down. He descended into the frigid, murky water, worked his way along the overturned hull, and found the ship's name, Charles S. Price. All 28 crew members were dead. Not a single body was ever found inside the wreck. They had all been swept away into Lake Huron, and the lake had scattered them across its vast floor, lost forever. But that was not the strangest part. When bodies from the storm began washing ashore near Port Huron, Michigan, several were wearing life jackets stenciled with the name of a different ship, the Regina, a Canadian steamer that had also been lost in the storm. And some of the bodies wearing Regina life jackets were positively identified as crew members of the Charles S. Price. How was this possible? The two ships were miles apart. Their routes did not cross. There was no logical reason for crew members of one ship to be wearing life jackets from another. To this day, no one has ever satisfactorily explained what happened. The leading theory, and it is only a theory, is that the two ships collided in the blinding storm, and in the chaos of the collision, crew members from both vessels ended up in the water together, grabbing whatever life jackets they could find. But there is no physical evidence of a collision. The wreck of the Charles S. Price, when it was later examined, showed no collision damage. The mystery of the crossed life jackets remains unsolved. It is one of the most haunting enigmas in American maritime history, and it happened not in some distant ocean, but in the middle of the United States, in a lake that most Americans drive past on their way to vacation.
The wreck that woke America up. If the White Hurricane of 1913 was the Great Lakes' deadliest disaster, then the sinking of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald on November 10, 1975, was its most famous and its most emotionally devastating. The Edmund Fitzgerald was not just a ship, she was a legend. At 729 feet long, she was the largest ship on the Great Lakes when she was launched in 1958. She was fast, powerful, and beautiful. She held the record for the largest cargo ever carried on the lakes. Sailors called her the pride of the American side. Crowds gathered to watch her pass through the Sioux Locks. Children waved at her from the shores of Lake Superior. She was, in every sense, a symbol of American industrial might, a floating cathedral of steel that carried iron ore from the mines of Minnesota to the steel mills of Detroit and Cleveland, feeding the engines of the American economy. On the afternoon of November 9, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin, loaded with 26,116 tons of taconite iron ore pellets, bound for Detroit. She was under the command of Captain Ernest McSorley, a 63-year-old veteran who had spent 44 years on the Great Lakes and was one of the most experienced captains in the fleet. A massive storm was forecast. Captain McSorley knew it was coming. He coordinated with Captain Jesse Cooper of the SS Arthur M. Anderson, another large freighter, and the two ships sailed together, planning to take the northern route across Lake Superior, hugging the Canadian shore for protection. By the evening of November 10th, the storm had become a howling nightmare. Winds exceeded 80 miles per hour. Waves were measured at 25 feet, with some reaching 35 feet. Snow and spray reduced visibility to almost nothing. At approximately 3:30 p.m., Captain McSorley radioed the Anderson. His voice was tense. He reported that the Fitzgerald had lost her fence rail, had developed a list, and had suffered damage to 2 ballast tank vents. He said, "I have a bad list and I've lost both my radars. Could you provide me with radar plots?" Captain Cooper agreed. For the next several hours, the Anderson tracked the Fitzgerald on radar, watching the blip that represented 729 feet of steel and 29 human souls struggling through the storm. At 7:10 p.m., Cooper radioed the Fitzgerald to ask how she was doing. Captain McSorley's last words, transmitted through the static and the howling wind, were, "We are holding our own." 10 minutes later, at approximately 7:20 p.m., the Edmund Fitzgerald's blip vanished from the Anderson's radar screen. Cooper tried to raise her on the radio. There was no response. He tried again. Silence. He called the Coast Guard. He called other ships. No one could reach the Fitzgerald. She was gone. The Edmund Fitzgerald had sunk in approximately 530 feet of water, 17 miles from the shelter of Whitefish Bay. She went down so fast that no distress signal was ever sent. No Mayday, no SOS, no emergency beacon, no life rafts were deployed, no life jackets were donned. The crew had no time. Whatever happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald, it happened in minutes, possibly in seconds. All 29 men aboard were killed. Not a single body was ever recovered. When the wreck was located on the lake bottom, it was found broken in two. The bow section and the stern section lay 170 feet apart, with a massive debris field scattered between them. The pilot house was crushed. The hull was torn open. The ship had been destroyed with a violence that defied easy explanation. And here is where the mystery deepens, because to this day, no one is certain exactly what sank the Edmund Fitzgerald. 3 competing theories have been debated for nearly 50 years. Theory 1.
structural failure. Some investigators believe the Fitzgerald's hull simply broke apart under the stress of the massive waves. A 729-foot ship riding over waves spaced 500 to 600 feet apart would experience enormous bending forces, her bow and stern supported by wave crests, while her midsection hung suspended over a trough. This hogging effect could have snapped her steel hull like a stick. Theory 2. Topside flooding. The official Coast Guard investigation concluded that the hatch covers on the Fitzgerald's cargo hold were not properly secured, and massive waves breaking over the ship forced water into the cargo hold through these hatches. As the hold slowly flooded, the ship grew heavier and lower in the water until a final wave or series of waves drove her under. Theory 3. A rogue wave. Some researchers, including several who have studied the specific bathymetry of the area where the Fitzgerald sank, believe that the ship was struck by one or more rogue waves, abnormally large waves generated by the interaction of storm waves with the shallow underwater plateau near Caribou Island. These waves may have been 40 feet high or more, and they may have struck the Fitzgerald with enough force to drive her bow underwater so deeply that she could not recover, plunging straight to the bottom in a matter of seconds. Captain Cooper, the last man to communicate with the Fitzgerald, believed until his dying day that she was struck by a massive wave or series of waves and simply went to the bottom. She didn't break up on the surface. She went down in one piece and hit the bottom so hard she broke apart on impact. The debate continues. The Great Lakes have not surrendered their answer.
The ships that were never found. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Great Lakes ghost fleets is this: hundreds of ships have simply vanished without a trace, not sunk in known locations, not wrecked on charted shoals, vanished completely, utterly, as if they had never existed. The Le Griffon, built by the French explorer René Robert Cavelier Sieur de la Salle in 1679, was the first full-sized sailing ship to sail the upper Great Lakes. On September 18, 1679, she departed Washington Island in Lake Michigan, loaded with a fortune in furs, bound for Niagara. She was never seen again. For more than 340 years, explorers, historians, and treasure hunters have searched for the Le Griffon. Dozens of claims have been made. None have been verified. The Le Griffon is the oldest and most famous shipwreck mystery in North America, and she remains as lost today as she was in 1679. The HMS Ontario, a British warship, sank in Lake Ontario on October 31, 1780, during the American Revolution, carrying between 60 and 130 soldiers, sailors, and civilian passengers. She was caught in a sudden storm and went down with all hands. Her wreck was not discovered until 2008, 228 years after she sank, lying intact in deep water, her masts still standing, her hull still whole, preserved by the cold, dark, fresh water as if she had sunk yesterday. The Bannockburn, a steel steamer, vanished on Lake Superior on November 21, 1902, with all 20 crew members. She was last seen by the crew of the SS Algonquin during a snowstorm. She simply faded into the snow and was never seen again. No wreckage was ever found. No bodies were ever recovered. The Bannockburn has been called the Flying Dutchman of Lake Superior, and sailors for decades afterward reported seeing a ghostly steamer matching her description, sailing through fog and storm on the open lake, only to dissolve into mist when approached. Part 6. The Underwater Museums of the Dead. Today, the Great Lakes shipwrecks have become objects of intense fascination, scientific study, and fierce legal protection.
Several states have established underwater preserves, essentially underwater museums, where divers can visit shipwrecks that lie in shallow enough water to be accessible. In Thunder Bay Marine Sanctuary off Alpena, Michigan, more than 200 shipwrecks lie scattered across 4,300 square miles of Lake Huron. Some are in water shallow enough to see from the surface on a calm day. Others require deep dives to reach. The wrecks span more than 150 years of history, from wooden schooners of the 1840s to steel steamers of the early 20th century. But many of the most significant wrecks lie far too deep for recreational divers. The Edmund Fitzgerald, in 530 feet of water, can only be reached by remotely operated vehicles. The deepest wrecks in Lake Superior lie in over 1,000 feet of water, in total darkness, under crushing pressure, beyond the reach of almost all current technology. And down there, in that black silence, the ships wait. Their cargoes of iron ore and coal and grain sit undisturbed. Their engines stand frozen in place, their anchors hang from their bows. Their nameplates, still legible, announce identities that the surface world has forgotten. And among them, preserved by the cold and the dark and the fresh water that acts almost like a natural embalming fluid, are the remains of the crews, the captains and engineers, the deckhands and cooks, the stokers and wheelsmen, the men and sometimes women who sailed the inland seas of America and never came home. Epilogue: Why America Forgot. The ghost fleets of the Great Lakes represent one of the greatest untold chapters in American history. More ships were lost on these 5 lakes than in any comparable body of water anywhere in the world. More lives were sacrificed, more mysteries were created, and yet outside of the communities that line the lake shores, Duluth, Marquette, Alpena, Manitowoc, and Cleveland, these stories are almost unknown. Part of the reason is geography. The Great Lakes are not the ocean. Americans have always romanticized the sea, the Atlantic, the Pacific, the wild blue water that separates continents. The lakes, no matter how vast, no matter how deadly, are perceived as something lesser, something tame, something domestic. But the lakes are not tame. They have never been tame. They are ancient, glacial, and savage. Lake Superior alone contains 10% of all the surface fresh water on Earth. Its storms can match anything the North Atlantic can produce. Its depths are as dark and as cold and as merciless as any abyss in any ocean. And the other reason America forgot is simply time. The great era of Great Lakes shipping, the period from roughly 1850 to 1950, when thousands of ships carried the raw materials of American industrialization across the inland seas, ended gradually, replaced by railroads, highways, and pipelines. The ships grew fewer, the crews grew smaller, the stories faded from the newspapers, then from memory, then from history. But the wrecks remain. 6,000 of them, lying on the bottom of 5 lakes in the heart of America, holding their secrets, keeping their dead, waiting in the cold and the dark for someone to remember. And the lakes themselves remember. Every November, when the winds shift and the temperature drops and the first Arctic front comes howling south across the Canadian border, the lakes remember what they are. They darken, they rise, they become once again the most dangerous freshwater bodies on Earth. And somewhere beneath their waves, in the lightless deep, the ghost fleets sail on, crewed by the forgotten dead of a forgotten age, bound for ports they will never reach, carrying cargoes that will never be delivered, telling stories that America has only just begun to hear. The Great Lakes do not forgive. They do not forget, and they never, ever give back what they have taken.